Hello, my name is Ahmad Marwad, and in today's discussion, I'll be discussing the experimental research and the non experimental research. First, we would learn the definition of an experimental research. The definition of an experimental research design. Experimental research, also called experimentation, is a research conducted using a scientific approach using two or more variables. The first variable is a constant that you can manipulate to see the differences caused in the second variable. Most studies under quantitative research method are experimental in nature. Experimental research helps you in gathering the necessary data for you to make better decision about your proposed hypothesis. The success of experimental research usually confirms that the change observed in the variable under study is solely based on the manipulation of the independent variable. In simple words, an experimental research design is a method that is used to collect data for experimental studies. And there are two types of experimental research design. First is the true experimental research design, and the other one is the quasi-experimental research design. Our experimental design, it determines by the way we classify our research condition and the group. So in the next slide, we would learn the definition of the two experimental research design. First is the true experimental research design. This research design depends on statistical analysis, which will either support or refute a hypothesis. This element of hypothesis testing makes this experimental research design the most accurate kind of research. All true experimental research design contain independent and dependent variables, pre-testing and post-testing, and experimental and a control group. Here, the effect of the independent variables on the dependent variables is tested or verified by comparing two groups. One group is given the intervention or a level of manipulation of the independent variable, which is also referred to as the treatment group, and the other is not exposed to the same intervention, which is also referred to as the control group. There is one more aspect of a true experimental research design, is that the participant in this study, they are chosen at random, because random sampling is very important in this experimental research design, because it ensures that the two groups are equated or comparable with any differences between the treatment and the control group, which are due to the chance and only the chances. This experimental research method is mostly used in physical science, or also known as hard sciences. Next is the quasi-experimental research design. This experimental research is similar to the true experimental research design, but they are not the same. The difference here is the assignment of participants in the control group. Here, an independent variable is employed and manipulated, but the participants of a particular group are not chosen at random. This design is generally used in settings where random assignment is either not required or not possible. Next is the definition of experimental research. Definition of non-experimental research. Non-experimental design include research design in which an experimenter simply either describes a group or examines relationship between pre-existing groups. The members of the groups are not randomly assigned, and an independent variable is not manipulated by the experimenter. Thus, no conclusion or causal relationship between variables in the study can be drawn. Generally, little attempt is made to control for threats to signal validity in non-experimental design. Non-experimental design are used simply to answer questions about groups or about whether groups' differences exist. The conclusions drawn from non-experimental research are primarily prescriptive in nature. Next, we would learn the differences between experimental and non-experimental research. Experimental research, the researcher sets up the environment and carefully controls the variables they are interested in. While for the non-experimental research, the research takes place in a real-life setting and it is not possible for the researcher to control all the possible variables. In the experimental research, it involves changing variables and randomly assigning conditions to participants, while for the non-experimental research, it is usually descriptive or correlational without any explicit changes done by the researcher. In the experimental research, it is easier to determine the causality, while for the non-experimental research, it is harder to determine the causality. In the experimental research, it does not compare the variables. Unlike for the non-experimental research, it compares two variables and describes the relationship between them. The experimental research, the control variables are manipulated, while for the non-experimental research, the control variables are not manipulated. In the experimental research, this research is scientific, while for the non-experimental research, this research is not scientific. Next are the examples of experimental and non-experimental research. An example of experimental research is laboratory experiment, which is one of the greatest examples of an experimental research, like researching on microbes and its effects on the animal's body. And an example of non-experimental research is non-experimental research establishing a study that there is a relationship between watching violent television and aggressive behavior have been complemented by experimental studies confirming that the relationship is a causal one. And that is all for the discussion of today. Thank you so much for watching, and that is all.